So this is a presentation that I've been showing since coming back from the launch of the 2020 Climate Leadership Campaign in Belo Horizonte, Brazil in August of this year, 2009. Laying out the kind of challenge that I feel we're facing right now and the kind of response that we might want to develop, and telling a bit the story of the first step in the 2020 Climate Leadership Campaign. This image, which came out in the German newspapers last year, just strikes me as such a great representation of what's happening as we see an old order falling apart around us, and then within the shell of that, a new order that's emerging, but the new order is not yet clear enough to be able to take over the helm from the old order, and we're in this chaos point of transition. So what I've been doing in the presentations is inviting people to ask themselves these 4 questions and to engage in a bit of dialogue about them for a few minutes. So if you feel like reflecting on these yourself as we go through, then you can pause the presentation and work through these questions. What do you love most about life? Essentially, what's driving us here is the love of life. So what is it that you love most about life? Then what pains you most about the world today? And what excites you most about the world today? And then what role do you see yourself playing in the global transition? This is always good. You can either reflect on it for yourself or find a partner who you might want to exchange with. A Sleep of Prisoners by Christopher Fry. The human heart can go the lengths of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the glaciers, the thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank goodness our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us until we take the longest step of the soul humans ever took. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is exploration. Where are we going? It takes so many thousand years to wake, but will you wake? So the flow of the presentation is to look at what on earth is going on, the situation on the planet today, the climate challenge in particular, and how do we respond to what we're sensing. This is an image from Professor Ervin Laszlo, which looks at the non-linear leaps that humanity has taken at different times in our history. And what's important about this is the non-linear nature of the change as we shift from one era to another era, because we're in one of these again, and that means that strategies for change based on a linear understanding of change no longer work in this kind of change context. So we have to be thinking about ways of organizing ourselves and leading ourselves that are going to lead to the innovation and breakthrough that we need. You literally cannot see the nature of the next phase from the consciousness of the current phase that we're in. Like the Einstein quote, you cannot solve a set of problems from the level of thinking that created them. The little wiggly lines here at each of these points, which Laszlo's drawn in here, represent experiments, and they are the massive experimentation that goes on during these phases, when we realize that the old ways of doing things don't work anymore, and the new ones are just not present yet. So what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of experimentation, and we need to encourage lots of experimentation. We need to encourage people to take risks, to fail, and learn from the mistakes and feed it back into the system and keep iterating as we go. It's that process, the very process of mass experimentation, that actually enables the breakthrough to happen eventually. Another one of Laszlo's related to this points to this bifurcation point, where any system or species at some point when it faces one of these existential challenges will either break through to a new order of living and being, or break down into its constituent parts. And the same applies just as much to us as the human species as to any other species on the planet. So there's no guarantee that we will make it. But there is every possibility that we can, should we organize ourselves appropriately and release all the creativity and potential that we have amongst us. Now, spending a moment on the current state of affairs is important. As Dr. Don Beck says, the best place to be in a crisis is the hard truth. And the reason for that is that literally our neural systems respond to life conditions when we really let those life conditions in. So in order for our biological system to respond to the intensity of the challenge that we're facing, we really have to let it in. That means face the reality, face the possibility of what might happen, and allow ourselves to sit with that, open our hearts to it, let it come in, and allow our system to respond. It's a nice quote from Edgar Mitchell, one of the astronauts. Civilization is in a critical state and mankind at an evolutionary crossroads. On the one hand, problems and conflicts have arisen which are global in scale and have brought society to a condition of escalating planetary crises. And on the other hand, humankind's potentials for creative change, fulfillment, and benevolent control of our environment have never been greater. So we get this process going on hand in hand where the old system breaks down and this immense creativity begins to emerge as we seek for something new. So our task is essentially to help the old break down gracefully and fertilize the soil for the new and enable the new to emerge and connect as effectively as possible. So if we look at what's going on the planet, we can see that there's a number of different systemic challenges that we're facing here. And only one of them can be headline news at a time, and yet when it drops off the headline doesn't mean it's gone away. And actually all of these different issues, the economic crisis, climate change, the food crisis, water, all of these things are all active now and are all reaching a critical point. And as Stephen Trevino points out here, each one of these domains holds the potential to greatly impact the Earth and is going to require a level of collaboration that is unprecedented in human history. So what's essential now is that we learn to get our act together in order to be able to deal with these. So our ways of working and organizing and creating the non-linear breakthroughs that we need are going to have to match the scale and speed of the non-linear change that we're experiencing around us. So focusing on climate change, and why focus on climate change? Well, I've spent many years looking at many of these different issues, tracking the systemic changes that are going on. And if we look at the impact that the warming of the planet is going to have, it's going to impact all of these different domains. So you can almost bring it back to this target that's been set by the 2020 Climate Leadership Campaign, which is an 80% reduction in CO2 related greenhouse gases by 2020. Now, none of the current political discussions are working at that level, but if we really look at what's happening and the feedback loops going on, then that's the kind of challenge that we have. And if we don't deal with that, then we're going to get a runaway climate change situation, which is going to have a massive impact on all of these systemic issues. So just focus for a moment on climate change. And of course, in order to get the kind of impact that we just talked about, we're going to need to take a systemic approach. So it's not that this is only focusing on one issue. This is like a gateway which enables us to realize that we're going to have to tackle all these different issues in order to ultimately get the impact that we need to be in a safe climate environment where we're not going to have hundreds of millions of climate refugees and massive devastation of ecosystems and species loss and huge challenges around food and water supply. So these images of the glaciers might be quite familiar from Al Gore's films and things. And one of the things that, I was aware that the glacier melt, of course, was going to add to sea rise level. And that being in the Netherlands, that's a major issue, of course, but also other areas of the world. But what I wasn't so aware of was the impact on drinking water, and having been reading Mark Linus's book, 6 Degrees, really realizing that when these glaciers stop actually melting and freezing and melting and freezing because they disappear, then they're going to stop feeding many of the big rivers of the world upon which a large number of people depend for their drinking water. So the glacier melt issue is going to have a severe impact beyond just sea rise level. It's really going to, with the moment that people run out of water, essentially, then they're going to have to move. Obviously, there are impacts around ecosystems as the temperature speeds up. This is an example of a bug, which the beetle larvae, which could survive in higher temperatures, and allowing them to have a greater impact without the ability for the trees to develop the natural defenses quickly enough to be able to deal with them. So these kind of impacts we're likely to see more broadly. This deals with the issue of, well, we've had ice ages before. Well, we have, but we've never in the last hundreds of thousands of years had a CO2 in the atmosphere, the rate, the height of which intensity of which it is right now. So we are in a unique position right now. We have to go along millions and millions of years back in order to find a situation with the kind of amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere that we have now. And one of the other big differences is, although there have been these ice ages, these shifts in climate before, they've happened at a pace which has allowed a lot of the natural systems to evolve with them and to migrate as they go with the temperature. But the speed with which this has been happening, particularly due to human intervention, is not giving the natural systems enough time to be able to adapt, which is one of the main reasons that the world's biologists have agreed that we're already in the 6th great extinction on the planet. And these feedback loops and understanding the nature of them is absolutely critical, because that's why we're getting this nonlinear shift right now, that all these different elements that global warming impacts on then feed back onto the global warming system, so that they're accelerating feedback loops as we go. And it's been very hard to calculate a lot of these, which is why many of them have been left out of the International Panel on Climate Change's calculations, which mean that the kind of scenarios they've got are pretty conservative. We can't really even afford to base our action on those estimates. We have to think of things as likely to be a lot worse than they're projecting. So we have to plan for the high risk scenario. This shows the kind of peak around runaway climate change, what's going to happen when we reach a certain level, and what we need to do to turn back. So our current strategy around Kyoto and even Copenhagen, as it's currently mapping out, is likely to take us over the hill, as it were, and down the other side. And we're going to need a kind of fairly radical turnaround to bring us back to the survival pathway. Here's a little summary of what goes on around different temperature change levels. We're currently at 0.8. Seems like governments are kind of saying we need to keep below 2, but even if we look at 2 degrees here, we're losing nearly all of our coral reefs, which is a huge part of maintaining stability in our ecosystems. The glaciers disappearing that we were talking about earlier. Now, to be able to keep us below 2 degrees is going to be a huge challenge. We really need to be heading down towards 1 degree max if possible. But our current trajectory is going to take us up 3, 4, potentially up to 5 degrees. So we're talking about a fairly fundamental change here if we're going to prevent massive ecological and social impact. And this is just a kind of devastating overview of what might happen if we don't act, as they're calling a climate Holocaust. This is a worst case scenario that came out a few years ago. And the thing which always worries me about this, when I first saw it, I was, wow, worst case, don't have to worry about that. And yet all the news, when it comes in, if I read in the paper, it's like, well, there's the data coming in from the scientists is pointing to us being way beyond the worst case scenarios that people have been working on. And it seems like our ability to develop our scenarios, etc., is being outstripped by the pace of change on the outside and the data coming in. So really what we need to be organizing ourselves just to release all of human potential to be dealing with this issue. So it's important at certain points to just stop and go, so how do I face up to this reality? What happens in me when I hear this kind of news? Am I able to deal with it? Do I reject it in any way? Am I going through different phases of grief, as Kubler-Ross would talk about, from denial to anger, through to eventually acceptance? But there's a number of critical phases we go through. So during the process, and I will have shown some video clips normally during presentations as well, we'll have people pause and just reflect for themselves and talk to each other about what's actually going on inside of them right now, and then making some of that explicit. So, Crossroads, a nice little piece which came in at the end of a poem somebody sent me. How to prevent world catastrophe. 1. Admit it could happen. Let it in. 2. Decide it will not happen. Take up a position. 3. Commit your vision and energy to number 2, without ever forgetting number 1. And that holding that duality and that polarity just seems to me as a very great way of summarizing, our coping strategy for this. So these from John Peterson, this kind of summary of key imperatives. Develop new thinking. We need to understand the world and its interconnected nature. We need to look at the values that we have, particularly focus on cooperation and collaboration. And we need to be looking for the tools to deal with these issues, because we're dealing with challenges, the nature of which we've never really had to deal with before. So how do we develop the new tools for addressing them? And we need to be taking an integral approach to this, which means we need to be looking at the interiors of our realities as much as our exteriors. So bringing it back to the big three, as Ken Wilber would call them, the I, the we, and the it. What goes on inside of me as an individual, and how do I adapt my own behavior? And the we, how do we create the fabric in our relationships that's going to be enable us to deal with this nature of the challenge that we're facing? And in the it's, what are the systems, technologies, processes, etc. that we have to have in place in order for us to be able to make this transition? And of course, we're going to need all the different sectors to be collaborating together. This from work by Stephen Trevino. So what do we do? Well, in this context, the 2020 Climate Leadership Campaign emerged from an initiative by Jim Garrison and others around the State of the World Forum. And the first place that it really showed up was Brazil, where thanks to the awareness, commitment, and energy of a woman called Emilia Quiroga, suddenly there seemed to be a huge upswelling of commitment to this in Brazil, including major commitments by Globo, the big media company there, different politicians and energy companies saying, okay, we understand the importance of this, and we're going to sign up for it. So the approach that we've been taking as part of this campaign is something we've been developing through the Center for Human Emergence in collaboration with Gaiasoft and other partners, called meshworking, which is a kind of form of collaboration between different stakeholders in order to really accelerate our learning and the impact that we can have on key issues. And essential to this is the concept of creating greater coherence. So what we're not trying to do is set up yet another initiative, but if you look at the emergence of everything that's going on, how do we help each piece become aware of the contribution it's making in the context of the whole, so that we get less overlap and better and more efficient use of resources? And if each different initiative becomes aware, okay, this is the bit I can contribute, then I need you, and you to be able to collaborate with. It's like the imaginal cells in the body of the caterpillar as they pop up, these imaginal cells of the butterfly. The butterfly emerges only when the imaginal cells start to communicate and connect up with each other and create a field of resonance between them. So creating greater coherence is critical at the moment, and amplifying and accelerating what works. So everything that we need to deal with this challenge already exists: the technologies, the knowledge, the know-how. We just need to find what works and amplify it, give it its place, and accelerate its adoption. Which reminds me of the GE little thing here, where they were looking at, they had lots of quality technology solutions, but they weren't getting the effective change that they need. And so they got in touch with the consultant and said, so what do we need to do? And they came back with this equation, which was Q times A equals E, where A